Racism in America has deep historical roots, particularly evident in certain regions where cultural, economic, and political legacies still echo past practices of racial segregation and discrimination. To label a state as inherently racist oversimplifies the broader narrative of progress, resistance, and the fight for equality. However, when examining states often considered among the most racist, factors such as historical segregation laws, hate group activity, systemic discrimination, and disparities in social and economic outcomes must be considered. Below, we explore the complex history and current realities of these states frequently cited for their racist legacies and issues. So, here's the list of top 10 most racist states in America. Before we start, make sure you subscribe to the channel and comment your thought. Here we go. Number 1. West Virginia. Historical context and legacies. West Virginia's relationship with racism stems from its tumultuous Civil War history and subsequent economic challenges. While the state itself was formed by seceding from Virginia in opposition to the Confederacy, that did not eliminate racial prejudice. Coal mining regions saw racial segregation, and African Americans often faced exclusion from union protections and higher-paying jobs well into the 20th century. Current racial challenges. West Virginia's relatively homogeneous population can contribute to a lack of exposure to diverse cultures. According to recent surveys and reports, Black residents report experiencing systemic discrimination in employment and access to education. Moreover, white nationalist activity has been documented in various parts of the state, reinforcing perceptions of deep-seated racial bias. Progress and efforts for change. Despite these challenges, organizations and grassroots movements within West Virginia work tirelessly to promote racial equality. Activist groups, cultural events, and educational programs aimed at fostering understanding among communities are on the rise. Number 2. Louisiana, a legacy of segregation. Louisiana's history is intertwined with slavery, Jim Crow laws, and segregation, especially in cities like New Orleans. The racial divide in Louisiana was reinforced by state laws well into the 20th century, contributing to systemic inequities that still manifest today. Modern-day racial inequality. Louisiana has some of the highest rates of incarceration in the United States, disproportionately affecting African American communities. The prison system has been criticized for perpetuating a cycle of poverty and racial disparity. Economic inequality between white and Black residents remains pronounced, with a gap in median income and employment opportunities. Cultural complexity. Despite its history, Louisiana also exemplifies a rich cultural blend stemming from African, French, and Spanish influences, particularly evident in music, cuisine, and art. This duality showcases the state's cultural vibrancy and potential for bridging racial divides through shared heritage. Number 3. Mississippi, the epicenter of civil rights battles. Mississippi's reputation as one of the most racist states in the U.S. is deeply rooted in its history of slavery and Jim Crow laws. The state was at the heart of the civil rights movement, with numerous pivotal events such as the assassination of Medgar Evers and the Freedom Summer of 1964 taking place within its borders. The state's resistance to desegregation was emblematic of its prolonged struggle with race relations. Contemporary indicators of racism. Mississippi continues to face significant racial disparities in areas like education, income, and healthcare. The state has one of the highest poverty rates in the nation, disproportionately affecting African Americans. Hate group activity, while not as widespread as in past decades, still exists and contributes to the state's image. Progressive steps forward. Mississippi has taken steps to address its troubled past, including the 2020 decision to remove the Confederate battle emblem from its state flag. Community programs focus on reconciliation, and education strive to combat systemic racism and promote inclusivity. Number 4. Alabama, segregation stronghold. Alabama's legacy of racial discrimination is well documented, with Birmingham being infamously known as the site of intense civil rights struggles. Historical figures like George Wallace, who once proclaimed segregation forever, epitomized the state's resistance to integration during the 1960s. Current socioeconomic disparities. The economic and social conditions in Alabama continue to reflect racial divides. African Americans face higher rates of poverty, lower educational attainment, and limited access to health care compared to their white counterparts. Incidents involving police brutality and racially charged violence add to the state's challenges in moving forward. Ongoing efforts and resilience. Grassroots organizations and advocacy groups work on issues of police reform, educational equity, and economic opportunity for marginalized communities. Local leaders emphasize that acknowledging Alabama's history is essential for genuine progress toward racial harmony. Number 5. Tennessee, a state of contrasts. Tennessee's history includes both stark examples of racial violence and significant civil rights achievements. The Memphis sanitation workers' strike, which brought Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to the state in 1968, remains a powerful symbol of the fight for racial and economic justice. Persistent racial inequality. Today, Tennessee experiences racial disparities in areas such as wealth distribution, healthcare, and criminal justice. The state has also witnessed a resurgence in hate group activities, with some communities seeing increased white nationalist rhetoric and actions. Positive changes and cultural shifts. Cities like Nashville and Memphis are hubs of cultural diversity and musical influence, reflecting a more progressive and inclusive atmosphere. Statewide initiatives focus on reducing racial disparities, encouraging conversations about race, and creating opportunities for minority groups. Number 6. Florida, historical background and legacy. Florida's history is marked by significant racial strife, including the violent dispossession of indigenous tribes and the use of slave labor in agriculture and infrastructure development. The state's Jim Crow era was defined by laws enforcing racial segregation and systemic discrimination against black residents. Contemporary racial issues. Today, Florida faces challenges related to racial disparities in criminal justice, housing, and employment. The state's prison system incarcerates African Americans at disproportionately high rates, reflecting broader systemic issues. Incidents involving police violence, such as the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2012, garnered nationwide attention and ignited discussions on race relations, profiling, and stand-your-ground laws. Positive developments and advocacy. Despite these challenges, Florida is also a state with significant racial and cultural diversity, particularly in cities like Miami and Orlando. Efforts from grassroots organizations, community leaders, and policymakers are aimed at addressing disparities and promoting equity. Programs focusing on racial justice and education have become more prominent in recent years, signaling a slow but important shift towards inclusivity. Number 7. Wisconsin, historical context. Wisconsin's history with racism is less visibly marked by events like those in the Deep South, but is deeply embedded in socioeconomic structures and urban policies. Milwaukee, the state's largest city, is consistently cited as one of the most segregated cities in the U.S. This segregation dates back to discriminatory housing policies in the 20th century that excluded African Americans from suburban neighborhoods. Present-day challenges. Racial disparities in Wisconsin are pronounced, especially in the areas of education, employment, and criminal justice. Studies have highlighted that black residents face higher rates of incarceration, lower educational achievement, and more significant economic challenges compared to their white counterparts. The 2020 shooting of Jacob Blake by police in Kenosha underscored persistent issues of police violence and racial tension in the state. Community and state responses. In response, Wisconsin has seen growing activism and calls for police reform, community investment, and educational outreach aimed at dismantling systemic racism. Efforts to bridge the racial divide include local initiatives that encourage open dialogues about race and support programs aimed at empowering minority communities. Number 8. North Carolina, a dual legacy of progress and struggle. North Carolina's racial history is marked by sharp contrasts. The state was an epicenter of both civil rights advancements and violent resistance to change. The 1898 Wilmington insurrection is a powerful example, where white supremacists overthrew a multiracial government, leading to deaths and the disenfranchisement of black residents. Modern-day racial dynamics. North Carolina continues to grapple with racial inequality. Issues of voter suppression have been prevalent in the state, with recent court cases challenging laws that disproportionately affect African American voters. Additionally, disparities in wealth, education, and health care between black and white communities highlight ongoing systemic challenges. Advocacy and progress. Despite these struggles, North Carolina has seen significant efforts to address racial issues. The state is home to various organizations that promote racial equity and social justice. Cities like Durham and Raleigh have embraced more progressive policies aimed at reducing racial disparities and fostering inclusive growth. Number 9. Kentucky. Historical foundations. Kentucky's history is steeped in the legacy of slavery and segregation. While not part of the Confederate States, it was a border state with a complex relationship to slavery and civil rights. Post-Civil War, black residents faced discriminatory laws and social practices that maintained racial divisions. Contemporary issues of racism. In recent years, Kentucky has been in the spotlight due to high-profile cases involving police violence, most notably the killing of Breonna Taylor in Louisville. This event triggered widespread protests and calls for reform, drawing attention to broader issues of racial inequality in policing and judicial practices. Additionally, socioeconomic disparities are evident, with black Kentuckians experiencing higher poverty and unemployment rates compared to their white counterparts. Pathways for change. Amid these challenges, Kentucky is witnessing a rise in activism and advocacy. Community-led initiatives focus on police reform, education equity, and economic empowerment. Leaders across sectors are working to create platforms for dialogue and policy change that address racial disparities. Number 10. Iowa, a state of subtle racism. Iowa may not come to mind immediately when discussing racism in America, but it has its share of racial challenges. Historically, the state has seen discriminatory practices against black and immigrant communities, particularly in housing and employment. Current racial issues. Today, Iowa struggles with racial profiling, economic inequality, and disparities in the criminal justice system. Reports indicate that black Iowans are incarcerated at a rate significantly higher than white residents, pointing to potential biases in policing and sentencing. Additionally, educational achievement gaps persist between white students and students of color, highlighting systemic issues within the public education system. Positive initiatives. Iowa is home to growing advocacy groups that work on bridging racial divides and promoting policy changes aimed at equity. Events like cultural festivals and public workshops aim to bring attention to the benefits of diversity and inclusion, fostering greater understanding among communities. Number 11. South Dakota, historical context and indigenous displacement. South Dakota's racial history is deeply intertwined with the treatment of Native American tribes, such as the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota Sioux. The forced relocation of indigenous peoples through treaties and violent confrontations, like the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, underscores a legacy of dispossession and marginalization. This history laid the foundation for systemic issues that persist today, including poverty and limited access to resources on reservations. Current racial issues. Racial disparities between Native American communities and the broader population remain stark. Native Americans in South Dakota face high levels of unemployment, substandard educational opportunities, and limited access to health care. Reports of discriminatory practices in housing and policing further highlight ongoing racial tensions. Law enforcement interactions disproportionately affect indigenous communities, contributing to strained relationships and mistrust. Community and state responses. Despite these challenges, there are ongoing efforts to bridge the gap. Nonprofit organizations and advocacy groups work tirelessly to address disparities and promote understanding between Native and non-Native populations. Initiatives aimed at celebrating indigenous culture, improving educational outcomes, and fostering economic development seek to create pathways for equity and inclusion. Number 12. Ohio. Historical patterns of segregation. Ohio, often viewed as a microcosm of the United States due to its demographic and economic diversity, has a complex racial history rooted in migration and segregation. During the Great Migration, African Americans moved to Ohio's urban centers in search of better opportunities, only to face discriminatory practices like redlining and employment exclusion. The legacies of these practices continue to influence the state's socioeconomic landscape. Modern-day racial challenges. Ohio remains one of the most segregated states in terms of housing, with cities like Cleveland and Cincinnati facing significant racial divides. African American communities often experience higher rates of poverty, limited access to quality education, and disparities in healthcare outcomes. High-profile incidents of police violence, such as the death of 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, have brought national attention to racial injustice within the state's criminal justice system. Efforts to combat racism. In response to these challenges, Ohio has seen a surge in community activism and policy advocacy. Civil rights organizations, educators, and local leaders push for legislative reforms that address systemic inequities. Additionally, initiatives focused on police reform, economic empowerment, and inclusive education have gained momentum, signaling a commitment to tackling racism at its roots. Number 13. Nebraska. Nebraska's racial history involves periods of racial violence and exclusionary practices, particularly targeting African Americans. In the early 20th century, cities like Omaha were the sites of race riots and lynchings, such as the 1919 riot that resulted in the murder of Will Brown, an African American man falsely accused of a crime. These events left lasting scars on the social fabric of the state. Contemporary racial realities. Today, Nebraska experiences racial disparities in areas such as incarceration rates, economic opportunity, and education. Studies have shown that African Americans and Hispanic communities in Nebraska face higher rates of poverty and are disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system. Incidents of racial profiling and reported discriminatory practices in law enforcement contribute to ongoing mistrust between minority communities and authorities. Positive movements toward change. Nebraska's response to racial challenges includes efforts from both the state and grassroots organizations. Local movements advocating for police accountability, educational reforms, and greater representation of minority communities in political and civic spaces have gained traction. Public discussions, forums, and cultural initiatives aim to educate and unify diverse populations within the state. Conclusion. So, guys, this was the top 10 most racist states in America. Hope you will like it and appreciate it. Racism is a deeply entrenched issue that permeates every level of society, and while it is often associated with specific states or regions, it is a national concern. Understanding the historical and current realities in states like West Virginia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee provides a lens through which we can examine broader patterns of racial discrimination and resilience in America. By addressing these issues head-on and promoting dialogue and education, the path toward racial equity becomes clearer, emphasizing shared humanity over division. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and press the bell icons for latest upcoming travel videos. Bye-bye. See you